my name is Caitlin Joseph, and I'm with American Farmland Trust. And we've put together a really great session for you today with some amazing panelists, and then we'll have some time to discuss with you all that are joining about this topic of women's empowerment in agriculture. We're going to approach the topic today with a really practical lens, kind of thinking about how the folks on our panel have, from our organization standpoint, really made a pivot this year to providing some non-hierarchical spaces for women to gather in agriculture and using that as an empowerment mechanism. So we'll really approach this from a practical standpoint, but we're going to discuss some high-level issues facing women in agriculture as well. So just before we launch in, to provide a bit of context around the work that our organization does. So American Farmland Trust is based in the United States, as are all of the representatives we've brought together today from our panel. And American Farmland Trust, AFT, works across the US on these three mission areas. So protecting farmland, promoting environmentally sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. So we really focus on a lot of conservation issues in agriculture and keeping land in agriculture, and kind of working on that development pressure issue. Within my role at AFT, I work on one of our national initiatives. We have 6 regional offices around the country, and about the same number of national initiatives, and our Women for the Land program is one of those. And we really focus on empowering women, farmers, and landowners to protect their land, keep it in agriculture, and to embrace conservation practices on the land. And we do that through 3 main mechanisms. So we look into conducting research to understand women in agriculture from various perspectives, their status, the barriers that they're facing, so that we can use that to inform our programming and policy advocacy. And then in terms of our actual programming, we do a lot of on-the-ground projects, really focused on peer-to-peer learning. So trying to create spaces for women to gather, especially with their peers, and access resources around agricultural conservation and really anything that supports their success in agriculture. And then increasingly, we're working to shift policy to help women really reach their potential in agriculture. So the research and the programming really inform that, and we'll be working on, with our partners around the country, on kind of how to mobilize women around helping them reach their potential in ag. So just to provide some context around, really the why behind this issue. In the US, we know, that women have been an increasing presence in agriculture over the last 3 decades. We've really only just begun to actually count women in agriculture through our agricultural census that the USDA administers. So really the data on demographics in agriculture there's been some improvements in recent years. There's still a long way to go in terms of accurately understanding and representing the breadth of women that exist in agriculture and the roles that they play. But we know that as of 2017, at least 43% of US agricultural land was farmed or co-farmed by women. So on the census, we were able to capture, women that are might not be at the helm in their agricultural operation, but are a key aspect of the production team. And then we also know that 37% of the rented farmland in the US is owned by women who might not be operating that land. So we also recognize that these women play a really important role in our mission areas as an organization. And it's worth us, providing some special attention to what are the barriers that they're facing that might support them in accessing more decision making. Globally, we know that focusing on gender equity, especially in agriculture, is really critical to climate resilience, to community food security. And, the cultural contexts around the world obviously shape the laws on the books that enable women to access various resources. So we know that there's, as much as we're facing challenges as women in ag in the United States, very different and difficult challenges really exist globally, but that we can learn from each other in terms of some of the practical applications of how we gather folks together and help them access resources and drive social change. So we know globally women are just 13% of all agricultural land owners. So quite a bit different than the situation in the US right now. But there's a lot of learning that I'll share that we've gleaned from partners around the globe as to approaches to solving this issue. So just wanted to highlight some of the barriers that we hear from women that we gather with. So some of these quotes are things we've heard again and again in some form in our learning circles. We usually provide a space at the beginning for folks to introduce themselves, individually tell their story a bit. And these are some of the quotes that really come through. So I won't read all of these, but you can see some of the themes throughout them really have to do with kind of nuanced gender dynamics on their own farm or operation, or just within the kind of agricultural community more broadly. So folks speaking to the good old boys club kind of thing. So really a lot of internalized issues that women are facing in terms of folks' assumptions of who the leader or the decision maker is in an operation, and needing to build that confidence to be able to access the spaces where resources are being provided to farmers, whether that's through USDA, NRCS, or other conservation organizations that are locally based. And then one other issue on here just wanted to highlight is just the kind of transition of ownership and decision making. So many of the women non-operating landowners that we've researched and worked with often find themselves in a role making decisions on land after a husband passed away or a brother passed away, and they haven't received the training that other men in their family might have received over their lifetime. So there's a lot of, increasingly this is an issue as land is being transferred from one generation to the next, which we know is an urgent issue in the US right now. So women are an important component of that. So one of the ways that we address this is through these peer-to-peer learning circles. And this is a picture of what one might look like when we're able to be in person. So, really trying to create sort of a flat, non-hierarchical structure where we would bring in, at least for a good portion of the day, women to gather with each other without men present, just to see what's able to emerge in that space. But we also tend to bring in agricultural resource providers from agencies that might be affiliated with government organizations or private organizations that are able to offer assistance to folks in agriculture around different topics and issues. So just one example of what these look like. Oftentimes we try to host these on a farm and provide some really hands-on demonstrations of the practices or the issues being discussed. So we'll talk a little bit about how we had to transition that in just a moment. But over the time, just wanted to note that this model really has been impactful, and there's been a demand for it really all around the country. So far, in the last few years, we've reached over 1,500 women across the US, And in our evaluation, we find that folks really do take action in some form or another, whether that's talking to their family about what they learned, reaching out to one of the conservation professionals they met to try to get access to a program or something like that. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention really the long history of this learning circle practice and its connection to cultures around the globe and across time. Really, this learning circle model, this idea of gathering people in a flat structure around a circle is basically as old as fire, right? So this is not necessarily a new concept, but it's a powerful one that has been used to drive social change in lots of different parts of the world and lots of different movements. One of the ways that we've seen this in the US was in the women's liberation movement with the consciousness raising circles pictured here in the top middle. And, AFT and Women Food and Agriculture Network partnered in some of the early days of this idea being applied to agriculture. So really want to recognize our partners at Women Food and Agriculture Network, which we have representation from today with Ren joining us. So we can talk more about that, but just wanted to honor the rich history of this model. So because of the pandemic, we've had to really think about how to shift this model to a virtual space and how to maintain that intimacy and the vulnerability that really drives the social change aspect of this learning circle model. So here at AFT, we did a lot of research in the first few months of quarantine and lockdown, and decided ultimately that Zoom was a space where we could use the gallery setting to sort of replicate that feeling of being in a circle around a fire, so to speak. It's hard to replicate the kind of hands-on aspects, but we did try that out with some virtual farm tours and demonstrations. So would love to, we'll talk more with our panelists about all the different ways that they made this transition this year as well. But even with just the few learning circles we've done this year virtually, we had about 10,000 acres of land impacted, and folks did report that their intentionality to take some action is still really powerful. So just share this to say that even though the virtual model, there's definitely something lost, right, in terms of not having the energy in the room together, but we still see it has a powerful impact on women's thinking and approach to their land. And then just some of the feedback is really women are craving connection in the pandemic. So as much as these online gatherings have been a part of our transition and adaptation to this temporary situation, we think this will be a powerful tool moving forward. So hope that some of you might consider what this might mean. And if you are considering conducting any workshops like this, wanted to highlight that AFT and the University of Vermont with Beth Holtzman supporting, and all of our panelists today really contributed to a virtual engagement guide that is now on our website. So please don't reinvent the wheel. You can use this guide to help support your thinking and planning. And I encourage you all to read the case studies where a lot of our panelists have provided a bit more depth on what they saw this year in terms of making this transition. So I want to go ahead and get us started in discussing with our panelists. So we thought it would be a nice idea to show you a little bit of what the agricultural landscape looks like in our part of the world. So myself, Caitlin Joseph, am based in Northern California, so you can see some wine grapes with nice cover crops growing here. So it's winter time right now, so they do look dormant like you see in the photo with the cover crops, but that's one of my favorite California crops. And then we have Beth Holtzman, based in Vermont, and a lovely picture of some pastured poultry happening in her part of the world. Lisa Kavirist, based in Wisconsin, and Ren Almitra, who's based in, her work is in the Midwest, and I'll let her talk a bit more about that. And Lashana is based in North Carolina, where collard greens are growing strongly in winter time in North Carolina. And Amber Smith is based in Montana, where we see beautiful Rocky Mountains on her ranch. So I'm going to go ahead. Caitlin, you're muted. Oh, sorry about that. So I'm going to kick it to the panelists now. Would love to have each of you talk a little bit more about the work you're doing with women in agriculture in your part of the world. So Beth, can I have you share first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and to share my experience with you, and hopefully to learn from all of you as well. So I work for the Women's Agricultural Network, which is housed at the University of Vermont Extension. And our program provides education and coaching and technical assistance, and also networking opportunities to women in agriculture. And our goal is to increase the number of profitable farms owned and or managed by women. The Women's Ag Network was founded in 1994, and along with the Women Food and Agriculture Network that Ren's part of, is one of the oldest programs in the US focusing on the needs of women farmers and ranchers and landowners. And just to add a little bit to the backdrop that Caitlin provided, nationally in Vermont, as well as nationally, census data shows that farms in which a woman is the primary operator tend to be smaller and more vulnerable to a really broad range of agricultural risks in the US. And that's even further amplified for new enterprises. And a very large percentage of our women farmers are also beginning farmers. And finally, women farmers are tend to be participate less in all of our public programs, federal and state and local programs, when it comes to things that could help them mitigate those risks and be more viable and resilient. So our programs are designed to help women get access to those services and be better prepared to be successful. And did you want me to talk now about sort of cultivating our connections, or wait for after everybody's introduced?
Yeah, you can go ahead and share a little bit about the connections you made with women in ag.
So from the beginning, the Women's Ag Network programs have focused on the learning needs and preferences of women, and that's driven both the content and the format in which we deliver our education. And to be fair, we do probably at this point, we do more education, which always has a very interactive component, than we are doing learning circles. But regardless of what we're doing, our in-person education always emphasizes the wealth of knowledge and wisdom that our participants bring to the room, and it really provides multiple opportunities for everyone to get to know each other and then to learn from each other. And some of the things that we do are just incredibly simple that encourage that, like just sharing contact information, of course, with permission from everyone, so that it's easy for people to get in touch with each other. Sometimes it means creating things like private Facebook groups or listservs where they can stay connected after an event. It means having guest speakers, and that's both farmers and service providers who are women. And some things take more facilitation, like small group activities where participants work together on problem solving. I think that's the kind of learning together that has been among some of the most powerful parts of our programs. I'll stop there and let others have the floor.
Um, Lashana, would you like to go next and tell us a bit about yourself and the work you've been doing to cultivate connections with women in agriculture?
Sure. Thanks. And thanks for having me. And it's good to see all of you who have your camera on, smiling faces. My name is Lashana Austria. Hey, Rachel. Yeah. um, I am in North Carolina, and I'm the founder of Kindred Seedlings Farm. And I'll try to be brief, but I'm going to try to give you a little bit of history of Kindred, and that may let you understand where I'm at and where I'm going. Kindred started about 3, maybe 4 years ago now, in the dining room of my home. And it was really an act of resistance to racism. I was the farmers market manager at a local farmers market in my community, and I was really struggling not seeing folks who look like me at the market, and that would be shoppers and growers. Um, and so just really becoming more interested in agriculture and meeting a lot of really beautiful female farmers, but none of them looked like me. There were no Black female farmers in my context, in my community at that time. And um, I just said, you know what? I'm just going to do something. I'm going to do something about this. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to do something about this. And so I started planting seeds in little cups in my dining room. And my husband was going ballistic. He was like, what's going on? All this dirt. Why are you bringing things in the house? What are you doing? And I said, I really want to be a face of, for other Black people in our community, so they can see that there's people who are really interested in agriculture, in farming, in food, in our food system. And so I started doing that. And then I partnered with a local university. If any of you are familiar with Elon University in North Carolina, look them up. They're pretty awesome. Some young students partnered with me and helped me with a business plan and helped me figure out what I wanted to be when I grow up and all the things. And so I started showing up at a local farmers market, selling literally little cups of dirt with anything from tomato seedlings to squash and okra and all the things that I was growing in my dining room. No grow lights, no idea what I was doing, but I knew I had to do something. And so I started that along with my daughter. She helped me. We went to the farmers market. And then I started meeting other women in the community, just like, hey, what are you doing? What's up? How can I get involved in this? I've been wanting to grow things for a long time. I don't know how to do it. Can you help me? So I started this group of women here, Indigenous women, Black women in my community. We do a lot of seed saving. We do a lot of seed exchanging. We just have conversations about what we're growing, how we're growing it, learning how to grow food in really small spaces. At the time, I was situated in a suburban neighborhood, only on a quarter acre of land, trying to figure this thing out. So I started growing potatoes in buckets and all kinds of things on my front porch and back porch, and started digging up the backyard. Um, and so that's how we got started. And it was really not because, oh, I'm feeling so connected to the land, or, oh, my mama and grandma and all that. No, not really. It was more because I was sick of not being represented in my community when it comes to food. So uh, fast forwarding a little bit, we've got a food collaborative in my community now with a lot of really brilliant, beautiful women. All of our things are done online. We've had retreats online. We brainstorm. We call it freedom dreaming, around how can we make agriculture kind of ground zero for doing racial equity work. How can we elevate the voices of Black and Brown people in our community who historically been left out of conversations when it comes to food and ag? How can we really expose like what's happening on a local level in our community when it comes to who has access to adequate food, who has access to the conversations about building around food and ag in our community. And so now, last year, we bought, continuing in my midlife crisis, according to my husband, we bought a 20-acre farm. Kindred's going to expand. I believe we're going to do great things. We love to grow okra. Okra is my favorite. So I'm really, some people are like, wow, okra, but I'm like, I'm aspiring to be a really good okra farmer. I don't want to do all the things. I want to do something really well. And on the farm, we have just spaces that, folks can gather, and lots of old barns and buildings that we're really trying to make sure that they're stable now. And they, it was a farm that was owned by Black folks back in the 60s and 70s. And so we bought that piece of property. And, we're just really wanting to be, for one, a face, to show other Black and brown folks that this is a possibility. And then we're doing it as an act of resistance, because we know that there's disparities in these United States, certainly all over the world, but in the United States, things are certainly right in your face when it comes to race and racism. And so we want to make sure that folks understand that, there's a remnant of Black and brown folks in our communities who are really interested in this and want to fight for change and want to fight for justice. Certainly, I was telling Caitlin, I was going to share a story from last year in 2020. I feel like Kendra just really did a lot, and had a really big presence, and we grew a lot. We had a lot of folks, reaching out. Hey, how can I buy things from you? What are you growing? We do a line of herbal tea blends with our herbs, and so lots of tea being sold. And so we saw a really big swell of interest in, African American farmers, brown farmers after the killing of George Floyd in 2020. And, what I say to that is, that's beautiful and that's great. And we appreciate, all of the love and the care that we've been shown, particularly during a pandemic and after such horrible racial discrimination in this country. And we want it to continue. We don't want it to be a tokenized type of thing. Oh, let me support Black farmers, when unarmed Black man is killed. But we want folks to know that, what we're doing is great, and it's good, and we need support, but we need support all the time. And when we start looking at the history of the United States of America, we know that there's been disparities forever in this country, and so really trying to right some wrongs that have been forever existing within our community. So I don't want to be long-winded, and I can be, because sometimes I can be that way. So I'm just going to pass the mic. But thank y'all for welcoming me into this space. It's really good to be with you today.
Thank you, Lashana. And we are seeing some folks chiming in the chat. You're getting some love in there, Lashana, and there's a question for you. So just wanted to also encourage folks to feel free to ask questions in the chat, and the panelists can answer through the chat as well. And I'll go ahead and log some. And if you don't get around to answering it, we can hopefully get around to it at the end. But thank you, Lashana. Let's see, Ren, would you like to go next and introduce your work?
Sure, thanks. Hey everyone, I'm Ren Almitra. I work for the Women, Food, and Agriculture Network. As I think Caitlin mentioned, and Beth as well, we've been working with a number of other organizations since the 90s, doing outreach specifically to women and non-binary folks. And we do our work through a number of programs, including a Plate to Politics program, which empowers women to run for leadership positions, whether that's on your local food board or county board or food policy council, to whether it's a Senate race. And so specifically around food and farming platforms, or training women just to support those women that, I shouldn't say just, but that's very important work to be supporting women that are running for office and leadership positions. We have a program called Harvesting Our Potential, which is a beginning farmer and mentor program. So we match aspiring and beginning women farmers, or more recently, we're growing our program to include existing women farmers, knowing that women are always learning more skills and building enterprises. And so we match, do one-on-one matches with farm mentors for a season, and provide stipends, I should say. Those are paid mentorships. We have a Women Caring for the Land program, which is similar to some of the programming that's been mentioned that other organizations are doing. We do learning circles specifically targeting non-operator landowners as Caitlin mentioned, a large percentage of land is owned or co-owned by women. And as Caitlin highlighted, we know that those women are often underrepresented or don't have the tools and resources they need to make best decisions on their farms. And so we work to connect them with those resources. We recently started a program called Growing Community Resilience, which really was a response to the pandemic and just a place for women to come together and network and talk about what was happening in their communities, what actions they were seeing being taken, especially in the agriculture scenes in their communities. That since grew to and kind of evolved in response to George Floyd's killing, this summer, to really dive into talking about anti-oppression and anti-racism work in the food systems in our local communities. And we do monthly calls with Growing Community Resilience participants, and we do breakout rooms into BIPOC and white European American breakouts, so folks can really have safe spaces to talk about some of these really broad important issues and specific issues in their communities. And then we come back together as a large group and talk about what's happening again in our areas. So that's a new program area we're growing and expanding through. We also have an annual conference that this year pivoted to online. I know we're going to talk more about our online work here soon. So I just wanted to mention a couple other quick things before I pass it on. So our mission is to engage women in building an ecological and just food and agriculture system through individual and community power. And we certainly do that through our programming. A lot of our work is absolutely in recognizing that we are a majority white-led organization with a currently majority kind of white member base. And so we're really looking at ways that we can continue to provide our needed programming to our current membership base, and also grow to both integrate more anti-oppression work into our programming and support BIPOC organizations and BIPOC farmers and those folks that have been doing this work for centuries and centuries, and ways that we can help dismantle white supremacist systems and again support other folks that are doing this great work. And so we recognize that we have a lot of room to grow in this, and are always looking for ways to partner with other organizations doing this work. As Caitlin mentioned, we're primarily Midwest based, but we do certainly serve women throughout the country, and we have some international membership base as well. And yeah, maybe I'll pause there for now. That was a very quick overview. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, it's hard to encompass everyone's great work, but thank you, Ren. Let's see, Lisa, we'll pass it to you.
You bet. Thanks, everybody. My name is Lisa Kiverist. I am coming to you from our farm in Serendipity here in southern Wisconsin. The snow is falling and the wood stove is cooking, so it's winter. So I had my midlife crisis early, Sean. So I, after school, got a job in Chicago in a cubicle with a paycheck that my whole family, everybody I was around with, thought was normal. And as a lot of city Chicago folks do, escaped up to Wisconsin on weekends and just fell in love with the countryside and land and stars and the freedom that comes with farming in that independent livelihood that we've created on our farm since then. So it was kind of pre-beginning farmer movement, actually kind of pre-internet. So it was pretty isolating and crazy at the time, but have been here now over 25 years. And the short story there is, if I can learn to farm without having planted a seed, anybody can. But a big part of my own personal story is that diversification and having different things going on. So I have over the years worked a lot in partnership with various nonprofit groups like the Women Food and Ag Network and American Farmland Trust in various forms on bringing women together. So I'm super passionate about the local networks and what we're talking about in different contexts, but the learning circle model, like Caitlin introduced, is really based on peer-based learning and how we as women learn best from each other. There was a study at the University of Wisconsin a couple years ago that you all know the results of it. I don't even have to explain, but they went to Wisconsin women farmers, although I'd argue it'd be the same anywhere, asked us where we go to for information. And like hands down, it was each other. And then way lower on the list were more traditional sources of information, our United States Department of Agriculture or various agencies. So in the work I do, it's both first and foremost bringing women together so we can share, but then also, as Beth was talking about, of connecting us to agencies and resources and programs that we historically haven't tapped into. And those are, at least in the United States, our tax dollars at work, and we should, and we must. So, so that's a big part of the work I do. I also do a lot of writing in the women in ag space. The book I did, Soul Sisters, a toolkit for women farmers, came about from this need that we as women in the sustainable and organic agriculture space really didn't have any resources. And so in this case, over 100 women contributed ideas. So it's very much on that shared learning model. My heart is here in southern Wisconsin and my farm roots. So I've always been keen on the local organizing. And I think if there's a takeaway from our session for all of us is, even if we have to get creative in the virtual space or whatever we need to get through the pandemic, is to bring women in our local community together. So we've been doing that here with our Soul Sisters group for over 10 years now. We've been meeting for potlucks, and heck, a lot gets done when women gather over good food and beer. You know, we're in Wisconsin. So, so yeah, but now being in the virtual space, it's made me realize even more so the importance of building community when times are good, because that's what's getting us through right now when times are rough. And we have those relationships with each other and we know each other, and that's huge. So the other thing that has stemmed from these cultivating of connections of women is increasingly, I see it here in my local community, but we need to see it more nationally and definitely globally, is more women stepping up to leadership positions. Ren mentioned like the Plate to Politics program that the Women Food and Ag Network does. And the research has shown, at least here in the States, that women need to be asked to run for office. And I think the number is even 7 times when a male will typically just say, hey, I'm running, and do it. And we all know where that can go. So we've seen it here locally, here in Wisconsin, where we have now 4 women on our county board, open-minded, conservation-minded, progressive women, which is huge where I live, because it's still a very conventional dairy, male-led area. So once we start getting together and we have those support networks, we'll take risks and we'll step up and step out, and that's huge. And we need that now more than ever. So it's an honor to be with all of you from all over, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thanks, Caitlin.
Yes, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I think the issue of leadership is so critical, and love that we have several folks that are working on that piece here. Let's see, Amber, can we hear from you next?
Hi, well, I just have to say the courage and confidence that Lashana showed to see a need in her community and feel a need in herself, and then step into action, not knowing how it might end, not knowing how it might go. That's exactly the desired outcome, and the outcome that I see when we gather and connect women. So I'm leading and developing the Women in Ranching program at the Western Landowners Alliance. And the program connects and supports, educates, and inspires a resilient network of social capital in agriculture. Every action we take as a program is designed to resource our community with valuable tools and relationships. We hold space for deep connection and inspiration, allowing women to press into their greater purpose and find increased agency in their lives. In order to answer the pressing needs of our time, climate change, food insecurity, inequality, access to land and necessary capital, mentorship and education, just to name a few, we must begin by attending to the people closest to the soil surface, the people who understand the change that is necessary and how that change can be led in their home community. Creating a better world for our children requires action today and demands a broader constituency of diverse and actively engaged land stewards who are equal in conversation about the direction of our collective future. The work that this program does and the community built by connecting women is the work that needs to be occurring at greater depth and faster pace across the grasslands of the world. We need more circles of community, not less. And my little circle of the world, I love the picture of the mountains, Caitlin, and I'm remembering I forgot to send you an image. My husband and I steward Antelope Springs Ranch, which is on the eastern side of Montana. We have no mountains, no trees, no running water. It's huge native prairie with great big rocky topped hills. It's really beautiful here. And I almost didn't make it because I broke down when I was out feeding cows this morning. So thank you to this group for your patience, and thank you so much for letting me join. And it's been great just to hear the introductions. It's always inspiring to be in a group of women.
Thank you, Amber. Yeah, so I'd love to hear a bit more from folks about some of the programming shifts that you made this year. I know Ren mentioned this, and Lashana as well, the kind of shift to online gatherings for women, and particularly interested to hear from you all about, you know, any examples that really stand out to you as, you know, when you saw this work well. So, you know, thinking about when were those online spaces able to cultivate the vulnerability, trust, intimacy that you've seen as being really useful for the work that you're doing. So let's see, is anyone, Lashana, would you like to go first? Your image was coming up, so it looked like you wanted to start.
I can start, that's fine. So when did this work well? I think the few gatherings that I've really felt grounded and good about were when I chose to make sure that there was no other noise, that I could really come into the space with my full self and not be distracted by all the things popping up, all the emails, all the things I wanted to be doing, and allow myself to be open to such a gathering. And I think for me, I tend to do well when I'm in spaces that are cultivated in a way that I can feel like there's some real trust, that there's opportunities for my voice to be heard, for my experience to be heard and honored, and not questioned. And I think that it's really difficult to cultivate spaces. I think in particular for women of color who may have had some difficulties like I have with white spaces, and being able to be in a a multiracial space is really difficult for me to open up and share in a vulnerable way. And yet it's happened several times in 2020. So I know that this is a possibility, and I know that it's based on relationships that were cultivated throughout 2019, 2018. And then when you come together with people that you can trust and you can build with, and you're sort of co-conspirators in the work, I think it just it gives you an opportunity to what I call freedom dream. And when you're freedom dreaming and you're not, there's really no big eyes or little U's, nobody's, devaluing your experience. I think that that's when real collective movement can happen, real collective dreaming and building can happen when we actually take the time to cultivate relationships. And it's not an overnight thing. It's something that we have to really work on and really be intentional about. And it can be done in multiracial spaces, multi-generational spaces. So that's what I'll contribute. Thanks, Caitlin.
Yeah, thanks, Lashana. Ren, would you like to talk a bit more about this transition in 2020 and what surprised you, what worked well?
Sure, yeah. I know that at least one or two other organizations have had virtual experience for years. So this was really kind of one of our first dives into what it was like to try to simulate our in-person, intimate kind of learning circles and other types of educational spaces virtually. So like everyone else, it was a pretty fast learning experience, learning curve and pivot. I think that a couple things that I would want to highlight, and I'm sure that many of us experienced that one of the silver linings for us is being able to connect women from across the country versus, a lot of our meetings are in a county, so we have maybe 20 people in a room, which again, we have found is some of the most effective ways that we can do our work and reach women is through the small, intimate spaces. And yet we are finding and seeing some success in providing larger virtual rooms with people from across the country. So that's been a really a cool thing to see. One of the biggest success stories for us is we had planned on a couple one-day events that when we went, those were going to be in person. When we had to pivot to virtual, ended up being a series of 4 events that we were kind of asking people to attend each one. Our numbers shrunk quite a bit. They went from like 20 attendees to like 9. Yet those 9 women have continued to meet since the summer monthly. So we're continuing to meet, and we probably will keep meeting for the foreseeable future to talk about their farm management decisions and choices. And that's something that I think would not have happened were we meeting in person, probably quite as easily, at least. This is something that we haven't seen before, haven't been able to really facilitate before. So that's been a huge success. We now have, as somebody said the other day, like a community of women who are mentoring each other, sharing their experiences. They have quite a range of experiences so far. Some are just starting their conservation decisions, management decisions for their farms. Some have been doing it for years. So that's just one little story I'll share that's been really beautiful. These women are all from Iowa, so from one of our states. So they're already talking about getting together when it's safe to do so. But they're several hours apart at minimum. So yeah, that's one unique thing that we've seen. And then I think also, being able to provide these affinity room spaces that I mentioned in our growing community resilience calls through this virtual platform is something that we've been able to do at our conferences, in-person conferences, but not necessarily through our programming. So that's been really great as well.
Thanks, Ren. Yeah, that reminded me just of one of the shifts that we saw this year too, was that it did feel like some of the gatherings were a bit smaller, and we worried, that it would be hard for folks to get the momentum going. But we found that some of the smaller gatherings were actually some of the more powerful ones, where, women were able to actually, as they were starting to tell their story, really digging deep into, what was the personal aspect of their connection to the land that they were in stewardship of. And it was actually one of our conservation resource providers who was joining a circle that surprised herself in, I think, getting really emotional while she was telling her story about kind of the dynamics in her family around this plot of land that they've been stewarding for a long time, and how she ultimately was not the one to have ownership over that land. She, broke down in tears while sharing this with the group, and it really opened up people to share their stories, and for that small group to stay connected over email for several months afterwards. So yeah, I think just to echo that piece that Ren shared about kind of those smaller groups really can cultivate some powerful connections still online. Lisa, anything stand out to you as what really worked well in online gatherings in 2020?
Yeah, I wanted to give a shout out. And I'm, as a glass half full person, it's been a little challenging during COVID, but I've been trying to look at things from the lens of what are things that we can do now, new skills we can learn that will suit us past the pandemic, and that's where I think creativity in virtual spaces is great, and something I'm growing on and trying to be open to. But I want to give a shout out to still the good old one-on-one communications, because that sometimes gets overlooked when we're talking about gathering in virtual spaces. And as women, and particularly women in agriculture, I've learned this last year to really tap into my intuition more. And when I'm thinking about another woman farmer, there's a reason, and to reach out, be it a phone call or a text or an email. I mean, I've had a lot of women that I've been like, email pen pals with us here. It's a little old school, but it's great. You know, and literally sometimes old school is sending cards and letters. The pandemic has taught me and our community here that it's very easy to fall off the radar. And we see that in our farming businesses where, yeah, in some cases, the pandemic's been an odd blessing. And we've seen increases in local community supported agriculture, CSA sales, and grass-fed meats are off the roof. But then there's women who like literally lost their businesses overnight because they were doing mostly wholesale to restaurants. And it's a hodgepodge. And it's that reaching out to people we haven't seen lately and doing it in a space that's comfortable. I had this personal happen, and to be open to new platforms. This happened to me this week where, needless to say, we have been struggling with everything happening in the United States, particularly on Wednesday here. And I was feeling really lost. And social media was dark and angry and not the place for me to talk about this for sure. And I'm not a texter, but I was like, I'm going to text people. And I sat there very clunky with my thumbs, and my local women farmers here, just one-on-one text. That was what we needed then, you know, to just have some space together to talk about things. And so we need to be open and creative in how we communicate, but don't forget the one-on-ones, because that's where people who might have fallen off the radar for various reasons, we need to keep connected with.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, Amber, how about you with women ranchers?
Yeah, so I will say that COVID has forever changed our program to what I would call a hybrid. When it started in 2016, the emphasis was gathering far-flung, disparate women on location, on host ranches for the experience. And absolutely, you can have a profound experience that way. However, you know, in some ways it was limiting for participants. I'm 87 miles to the closest town, and I consider myself fairly metropolitan compared to many of our women who, you know, it might be 5 to 8 hours for them to get to these locations, even though it's in their state. So being able to host things virtually has, I think Ren mentioned this, allowed people from different places, women who would have really struggled taking that much time when you include, you know, driving that much. And then even if you're on location only 2 days, but you spent 3/4 of 2 days driving, you've now removed yourself from your business or family for 4 days. And this was something when I first started fundraising for the program, I had a lot of people, you know, oh, why don't you do some of this virtually? And I would just argue right back that, you know, the value these women give everything year after year, all year long, the least we can do is provide a space for them to come together. I still fully believe that. We will definitely, when it's safe, go back to hosting some things in person. However, virtually you get a broader group from different places. I'm able to bring incredible keynote speakers that I could have never afforded if you had to bring them on location. And, you know, so I think economically, it makes a lot of sense. You know, access for different types of people, it's made a lot of sense for our women. And we actually started, it was maybe 2 weeks into the pandemic. I was just getting a lot of emails and texts from participants, just struggling and worried with what was happening. And so we started a community check-in call series for 10 weeks. And the first one, I honestly assumed I would be looking at myself for an hour. I didn't really think anyone would show up virtually. And the very first one, we had 6 women. It was really fun. And then by the second one, we had 37 women. And then that fairly well continued. Every week, other than the week that we asked them to write a poem about themselves, we only had 11. But like someone mentioned, the smaller, maybe it was Ren, the smaller groups, there is a dynamic that's really special. And what we found is if we had 12 women or less, We could stay in the same Zoom room for an hour 15 minutes and have a really wonderful experience. If we had more than 12 women, the opening and closing was together, and then the middle portion, once our facilitator gave the cues, we went into several breakout rooms. So we did that for 10 weeks, and then we hosted a virtual confluence this fall, and it was great. I mean, we had great participation and a lot of different people show up, and throughout the conference, people were in the chat, you know, how can we keep in touch? Can someone send me your email? And so the tech team put together a Google form, stuck it in the chat, and I went in, and at the same time, like 112 women were populating this Google sheet. It was amazing. And I've seen Montana and Colorado, the participants from those states have now continued to meet monthly. So that's great. What I mentioned earlier, seeing someone hear a need for themselves, see a need in their community, and then find the agency and the courage to step out. I have seen that virtually just as much as I have seen in person.
Thanks, Amber. Beth, I know you had the fortune, like myself, to put together this guide that I mentioned and read through a lot of these case studies from around the country. I wonder if anything stood out to you in terms of what has worked really well to cultivate that vulnerability in online space.
I think it can be challenging to do that, and size of the group and how you do your introductions can make a difference. In my personal experience, sometimes there's just one or two people in the group who step up and are vulnerable and open, and they kind of set the tone for the whole group. And as facilitators, I'm so grateful when that happens, because it feels like that is so much more impactful than any strategy that I can offer. But generally, yeah, being deliberate about how we structure it, and how we structure the session. I think the other thing is, for me, is to going back to that idea of the wisdom and the strengths and the assets, to encourage everybody there to go from a place of what they bring in terms of assets, instead of a I can't say the word right now, but instead of what's wrong, think about what's right, and what they can build on actually helps people bring authenticity and vulnerability. So those are the things that I can see. And I'd love to hear what other people have to say on that.
Yeah, that really reminds me, Beth, of something we talked about on our team a lot, that it's sort of harder to wing it in a virtual gathering where you're really trying to intentionally cultivate connection. You do have to sort of be extra thoughtful about modeling and setting the tone that you would like to see, and yet really being thoughtful about who you have in the group that might
produces media and publications for and about the Young Farmers Movement.
Oops. Let's see. Maybe someone was multitasking, listening to multiple sessions. But yeah, I think that's something that we mentioned in the guide that we talked about earlier, that really kind of putting a lot of energy into the planning portion to make sure that you have the right folks in the room that can support the tone setting in the group and kind of cultivate that. So we're running a little short on time for the interactive portion, but I just wanted to offer a chance for our panelists to answer any questions that have come through from the audience. So one that I saw in the chat that I don't think our panels have gotten to yet is kind of around this issue of leadership and representation. I didn't catch who wrote it, but they said, do you believe that through the overrepresentation of men in policy making around food, female food production is underfunded or lacks supportive policies? So I'm trying to think who, happy to kick this to anyone who has thoughts. I know from our perspective, we've been sort of brainstorming what a policy platform might look like to support women in agriculture in the US. And we have a long way to go to, before vetting that with all different groups of women across the country. But I do think this issue of the underrepresentation of women in policymaking spaces has, had an impact on what policies are on the books. Just one example, really simple in terms of just data collection. I think the US Ag Census previous to the last round in 2017, the way that they asked the question of folks to self-identify as the farmer really was not aligned with how a lot of women saw themselves as represented in their roles on the farm. So, getting more information about how to even ask questions on surveys where we're just trying to track, the demographics of who exists in agriculture already. Having more women at the table to shape the way that those questions are asked, really is important to ensuring that there is representation. And I know in the case of tracking race and ethnicity in agriculture, there's also a very long way to go in terms of, appropriately representing that. I saw in the chat, we've been discussing even just this term of BIPOC folks and, just the shifting language and landscape, race in particular is a very, it's a social construct, right? So it's a really difficult thing across multiple social contexts to provide a blanket term that is, helpful or useful or really represents what folks' individual identities are, right? And so there's all a layering of these identities. And I think one of the things that we would love to see in the future is the agricultural data being able to actually better represent, better capture what those intersections are between women's identities as, as women or as gender non-conforming folks, and how their racial and cultural identities also layer into that. And because all of that shapes what they're able to access in agriculture, right? In terms of resources, in terms of, the consumers that they sell to and things like that. So I don't know if anyone else had thoughts on this question of kind of the overrepresentation of men in policymaking spaces or underrepresentation of women, how that affects the support that women get. Ren, I wonder if any of the plate to politics work that you all do, have you all noticed any dynamics related to this within that work?
Sorry, Caitlin, it's a huge question that I really appreciate. So I'm thinking about it. And I have to be totally honest, I haven't myself been super involved with our Plate to Politics program. But I think that, and sorry, Caitlin, you might have already said, but I think, like LaShawna mentioned earlier about representation of Black women, Indigenous folks, on boards and or in the food scene in general, like how can we actually have just systems if we don't have representation? And so I think that yeah, Elisa mentioned earlier, you know, women often have to be asked multiple times to run for office, and it's often because women tend to not feel confident about making decisions or running for office or doing things unless they feel 100% confident, like they have all the knowledge and they have all the tools and they have all the support or resources they feel like they need to do that. And we really encourage women to run as you are. And that's a slogan actually that's with a partner organization called Vote, Run, Lead. That's not ours, but that they really encourage women to run as you are. And so the point being that men tend to do not necessarily the opposite, but they don't need as much of that kind of that information or those resources to run. And so I think that what I'm trying to say is that the more women we have in those positions, I think the more that it will help other women run and try to get into those positions. I'm sorry, so not being articulate right now, but the more representation we have, the more encouraging it will be for other women to be in those positions. And absolutely, I think that affects how decisions and policies and funding is made. And so, yeah, I think it's, I'd rather see somebody else has an answer to it. I don't feel like I'm being articulate, but I really love that question. And I think it is absolutely at all levels really important to have that representation.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Ren, that it kind of snowballs, right? That you can't see what you can't be, right? That and you know, the more folks you see that look like you, the easier it is to give voice to that perspective as well. Any other panels have thoughts on this?
I want to add, because it's a great question and it's a big one, and often the idea of running for office is big, and sometimes it doesn't fit into people's life space with other commitments, much less farming. But there are so many creative ways to be in positions of power, and that's what we're talking about. Because to the question, yeah, we need more women because this is bottom line where dollars are being allocated and resources and other things, and we need more diversity of voices, period, and women can bring that. But to get creative in how you can have your voice heard, we sometimes that's working for policy in the sense of a bill or something. I mean, I'm amazed at how we can get things out there, whether they pass or not, just getting the ideas out there. I've been working a lot here in the States in what we call the cottage food space, which is state laws that allow you to sell food products out of your home kitchen, which is a huge entrepreneurial boost, particularly for women, to like sell your canned items or sell your baked goods, et cetera. And we hit barriers basically created by white men in Wisconsin that we couldn't get our cookie bill passed to sell baked goods. And so myself and two other women farmers here ended up suing the state and won over the right to sell cookies, which is both humorous and pathetic. Do you know that we had to do that? But the point is there's other ways. We worked on that for 2 years in the judicial system. We have options. And to what we're all talking about, of knowing other women have your back, means so much in taking those risks and stepping out. My local Soil Sisters group writes a column for our local small town paper, something we volunteered to start doing last year to get women's voices in. You know, most papers are happy for copy, et cetera. And we were working under a female editor. Well, fine, nothing, no issue. A male editor came along and started editing things and putting things like soil brothers and sisters into somebody's headline last month. And we're like, you know, we're going to bat with our local paper on this, but you can't do that. You can't, you know, in a sexist way, we were arguing, edit our copy, and we'll see. Stay tuned where it ends. We might walk. You know, we might find another paper. We might find something bigger, because we have to fight these things on a local level and point them out in a professional way, might I add, but to still do that. So there's all these little battles daily that we need to not ignore, because I realize we are all busy with multiple things, but we got to take it on.
I'll just add, you know, some of what I see quite a bit of difference in generations in ranching. So which I haven't now for a year, everything's been virtual, and now that things are virtual, there's just less people attending generally. But in my local area, when I attend a regional meeting of like ranchers, conservationists, tourism folks, or there's a couple of ranching organizations and I go to the meetings, it's significantly men who are 55 or older, and then pretty much all of the women in the room, other than me and sometimes one other, the women are like NRCS or a Pheasants Forever representative or something to that effect, which is a bummer. Like, you know, it's a bummer. But I'm seeing, you know, women who are coming into these communities that are 30 and younger are coming in with 4-year degrees, typically in ag or ag business, communication, journalism. So I think there's going to be this surge of women showing up in these places who are not comfortable walking in very traditional roles. So the man is the rancher and he is outside doing the work. The woman is the wife and she is inside the house taking care of the children and cooking and cleaning. So in my 16 years in rural ranching communities, that is the structure that is typical, that is supported, that is comfortable. So anytime a woman shows up in a way that doesn't perfectly align, both men and women are correcting her back to her place. And so when I think about women running for office and this political piece, I bring it all the way back down to what is happening in these homes, what is happening on these ranches, what is happening in these communities. All of that plays into that next piece. And so, for instance, last week I was calling ranchers. I had a question about a tool that's being trialed on a ranch. And I recognized before I started making the calls, I only knew the men from those ranches. I knew they had children, meaning there must be a wife. And it made me so sad. I didn't know a single one of their names. So in the 5 phone calls I made, a woman answered. I introduced myself and said what I was looking for. And then the phone was immediately handed to the husband. And so there's just a lot of work to do. And for women who are coming into it and showing up differently, it can feel challenging and it can feel lonely. And so her finding other women to support her and celebrate her and continue to encourage her to go for it, it's just really critical if we're going to start seeing women taking political seats. It starts on the farm and ranch. Like, I hope, my daughter is 10, so she has what, 8-9 years left in my house. I hope significant changes happen by then, but I have days where I really question if I have the energy to see it through, because it's, you know, it's all of us pushing and moving together and celebrating all the ways that women show up and supporting her, how she's comfortable, and always asking, you know, what is your heart saying, and what would you like to be doing, and how would you like to show up, and how can we support you?
I manage a farm in England for a wildlife trust, and this is exciting, meeting you all and hearing you all speak, because European politics are such that I believe a time is coming, and that many of the women and people who are the farmers of the future aren't from the countryside. They aren't born into tenancies, or there's very few farmers left. The average age is 64. In 2 years' time in the UK, farmers and land managers, including wildlife trusts, are going to be offered a lump sum to get out because of the environmental damage that's been done by the Common Agricultural Policy and everything else. So where I'm coming from is it's all change. And what I'm really excited about is if we get it right in terms of, like, we have 5,000 children a year come to the farm, which isn't huge. It's about 80 hectares. Most of it's focused on soil, food security for people and wildlife. That's the basic sort of strap line in there. And I think it's really important, this is fascinating, this politics. I hadn't thought about it the way that I'm hearing from some of the speakers here, but it's really important that we think about business planning, long-term planning, what it is that we want, how we're going to survive the absence of the subsidy, when in 2024, it means that a lot of land is farmers just aren't going to use the subsidy to prop up unprofitable cropping. And there's a huge opportunity for people to approach people who've got land that they don't know what they want to do with it, and for diversifying. But somehow we've got to articulate what is that we're asking for? What is it that we're saying we're going to grow? How are we going to market it? How are we going to do this and that? Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, that reminds me that I think this was an issue that Amber, wanted to speak to, also around kind of land access and kind of the bringing in those beginning farmers. And like Beth mentioned early on, we know in the U.S. women in agriculture are an outsized proportion of beginning farmers. So I think that what you're highlighting is really important, that there is a real need for increased intentional support for folks that are entering agriculture and helping them plan their businesses. And this is definitely something that comes up as a theme in our work with women in ag. And our organization actually has a land access curriculum as part of our Farms for a New Generation initiative. So if folks are interested in that, that might be a helpful resource. But Amber, I know this was something you wanted to talk a bit about, was kind of land access. Anything you wanted to say in regards to Caroline's points?
Well, I'm not sure I can respond to Caroline's points because I was absorbed in the chat. So if somebody else, I apologize. If somebody else wants to respond to her points, go for it.
Sure, sorry to put you on the spot. Ren, is this something that has come up in y'all's work around business planning in particular? I know that's something that we hear from our network a lot.
Access to business plans specifically, or getting to that?
Yeah, I think, Caroline, I think part of your question, correct me if I'm wrong, is kind of how do we build and increase that type of support for folks around planning businesses, right?
Yeah, whether, what model, whether it's an individual person, woman, or whether it's some kind of collaboration, it's having more support in terms of what's entailed. What's needed and what's actually going to make a profit at the end of the day. It might be a not-for-profit enterprise, not counting that out, but the food system, certainly in Europe and the UK, is becoming very much the 80-20 rule, that 20% of the farmers are going to produce the bulk of the food. But that leaves a huge amount in between of land management that doesn't conform to the intensive farming model. My background is an agronomist as well, so I understand the finances from farming and things like that. And that there isn't finances, and that most farmers are actually in Europe and in the UK are very worried and likely to step out of farming to preserve the bit of funding they're going to get that's the last of the Common Agricultural Policy. I don't understand enough about subsidies in other countries, in there. But again, what I'm feeling is that I know there is a huge opportunity coming up if this kind of alliance and the kind of meetings that sharing of information that we're having tonight, there is, for the first time since the war, World War II, a huge amount of land coming up, some of which is just should go back into producing habitat for wildlife, some of which should be storing water for flooding, storing carbon, etc. But we in the UK have got to look at land for the public goods that it delivers, as well as food. So carbon, water, flooding, fire, blah, blah, blah. That's a lot of things for anyone managing land to work their mind around. But it's also a tremendous opportunity. I'm not sure about the term regenerative because it's got so many different aspects to it, but it's balance, a balanced use of the countryside, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I hear some of those points for sure, resonating with the work that our organization, a lot of the panelists work on, specifically around the issue of subsidies. I think it's just kind of another term for some of what we were addressing in terms of the conservation programs. So I know in the United States, the federal government issues different, really basically the policy mechanism or the approach in the US to kind of conservation agriculture is by voluntary incentives, right? So, you know, I know in the UK, the Common Ag Policy is kind of the version of our Farm Bill. And a lot of the programs that myself and Beth and Ren mentioned as being part of what we feature in our learning circles are, you know, we actually bring in staff from the federal agency that administers those programs to make sure that women understand the human face behind those agencies that can actually help them access those payments from the government that can help them implement those practices, because we know that women are underrepresented and they're actually not getting the allocation on parity with their male counterparts to those kinds of programs. And some of it has to do with their land tenure situation, right? That they may not be eligible if they are renting land on a short-term basis or something like that. And then also your point about kind of the balanced, you know, use of land and the different ways that land can go into serving the public good. And just wanted to highlight it, saw something from Sagar in the chat about, you know, kind of the opportunity to think about land going into public ownership or not, you know, this concept of even what ownership is. And that's definitely something I know our team has been grappling with, is thinking about, you know, as this generational transition is happening, how do we support the women who are in a position where they really want to reallocate their land as a resource to, you know, indigenous communities that, you know, you know, or into kind of collective ownership models where there might be a community land trust that would kind of hold that land in perpetuity for producing food for the local community. Examples like that, you know, what are the opportunities for us to be kind of lifting up those through these gatherings that we have with women farmers. I wonder if with that elaboration, any other panelists have any other last words on this? Otherwise, we're getting kind of close to our time here.
I can hop in. Beth, were you wanting to say something? I see you're unmuted.
I have a lot of things I want to say, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to say that I think, so we focus on helping our clients, our participants, make informed, intentional decisions that align with their values and goals. And I think, so the more that we can uplift women to do that, and that they may not be pursuing, you know, there are many different models for ways to farm and enterprises and size and scale and what you do off farm and how you balance it with your family. And so I just wanted to sort of you know, instead of being driven by an external goal, that we're really trying to help women work together in those spaces. In like, that's what the learning circles, then peer learning can really help women get affirmation to pursue what they want. And it might look different than what a preferred policy alternative might be, or what the driving thing is in the commodity, or how the land has always been farmed in the community.
If you can limit it to about 30 seconds, we have.
I can very quickly. I've done some work in Macedonia and Croatia and things. The trouble with farms in this country is they're heavily mechanized and dangerous. When I went over to Europe and saw people taking families out, and they were working what I would have deemed safe, the family could accompany them out to the field. Whereas here, you know, the farm's dangerous, as is told by the number of deaths of farmers every year. That's it.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Amber, did you want to give any last thoughts in response to that question?
Yeah, so here in, you know, what I read in the ranching community is that 60% of our rangelands are going to come into new hands in the next 8 years. 60% of the American West. The average rancher is 64 years old. So I'm not even going to talk about women particularly, just the people next, no matter who they might be or how they might look. I would say we're going to be in a crisis situation. And because land values are so disparate from production values, my husband, like for instance, my husband and I have no foreseeable future being landowners. I'm okay with that. We steward land for other people. But what does that mean for everyone else coming into it? So there's folks trying to put together cooperative models. There's one right now that's working really well, and they call it grass banking. And so an owner of a ranch will allow 5 to 6 different families to have 20 to 30 to 50 head of cattle grazing in common. And that's been really positive, and that's a really big shift from our very individualistic Western agrarian culture that we have. It's actually the first time I came into contact with one of the groups. My husband, who grew up in ranching, said, I have never met ranchers this progressive. I know no one in my home community who would graze in common with a neighbor. So we're going to have to get creative really, really quickly. And I think that's part of this, just opening the door to the women who are already here on this land. That diversifies our engagement right away. But you know, our diversity is going to need to be broader than that, because we have a lot of pressing challenges, and we really, really need all hearts and hands and minds at the table if we're going to change anything before the next group of folks is in here, you know, trying to steward and care for these landscapes.
Thanks, Amber. We're over our time, so unfortunately we'll have to close out, but I just wanted to really thank all of our panelists. I think the like Amber said, the heart forward aspect of what we're doing, I really think is a force for transformation. And so I hope that those of you who joined and listened today can continue to connect with our panelists to the extent that it's relevant. And you know, feel free to reach out to myself, and we'll try to answer any other questions that we didn't get to. And just want to encourage you all to think about, you know, how the women in your part of the world are, you know, navigating these challenges, and what ways that, you know, you can draw from some of these lessons to gather them and find your power in creating that change. So just want to thank everyone again, and wish you all well, and hopefully we'll see you at the rest of the conference.